All right, this is the Life of Pi wrap-up discussion. So make sure that you've read the entire novel, including the ending, the very, very last parts. So next class, we're going to do the open prompt, and I'm forcing you to write about Life of Pi. Next week on the 18th, some of you are taking the AP exam, and the third essay is the open prompt. They will give you a list of works, and they'll give you a question. They'll say, choose a work from the list below or a work of equal literary merit. You want to just choose a work that you've already read. So you're going to go into the test with a list of 3 works, basically mentally, that you want to write about. I would encourage you to pick one that you really, really hope to write about, and like 90% chance you'll get to write about that one. But just in case, have 2 fallbacks. So if you did enjoy Life of Pi, and after this discussion you feel like you understand it enough to write about it, certainly it's fresh in your mind, I would encourage you to write about it. But everyone for your own grade is going to have to write about this on Friday. So the things we discussed, this is not going to be exhaustive. I mean, you could spend like weeks talking about this book. But these are things that you could definitely put in your writing. So the open prompt question, you're going to have to connect some element of the novel, and they'll specify this in the prompt. It's characters, relationships, themes, etc., to the overarching meaning of the novel as a whole or the character as a whole. So that means you need to understand how major elements give the novel its meaning, as well as explicitly what that meaning is. Here's an example of the open prompt. This was from, I think, 1990 or so. Choose a novel or play that depicts a conflict between a parent or a parental figure and a son or daughter. Write an essay in which you analyze the sources of the conflict and explain how the conflict contributes to the meaning of the work. They may or may not tell you to avoid plot summary. You should always avoid plot summary. So there's always an element that's required by the prompt. In this case, it's a parent or a parental son, or a figure rather, and the conflict with the son or daughter. And then they're asking you to link it to the overall meaning. And that means explicitly in your essay somewhere, I should be able to highlight, here's the overall meaning of the work as a whole. So again, this is not an exhaustive discussion, but these are several things that I think are manageable to discuss today. So we'll talk about structure, characterization in terms of Pi, his personality and beliefs. We'll talk about the idea of the novel as an allegory. And then something unique about this novel is it actually demands the reader to be involved in creating the meaning. And we can extend this to absurdity and existentialism that we studied earlier in this unit. And this would be a good thing to include either in the intro or the conclusion. It could be that little extra that gives you that sophistication point. All right, so first thing to talk about is structure. The novel obviously is broken into 3 parts. Part 1 spoils the plot from the get-go. We know from the start that Pi has survived the shipwreck, so there's no tension in terms of the general plot. The story is not about literal survival. We don't need to know that because we already know he's survived. So there's something else going on that's causing tension. Part 1 introduces the frame story. So there's this fictional writer, not Jan Martel, the author of the novel, but this fictional writer who's a character. And he is seeking a story. He's just trying to write a good story. But he's promised, okay, if you go talk to this guy named Pi, he will tell you a story that will make you believe in God. So this is a promise that is made to the reader early on. So we, the reader, are going on this journey with this fictional writer to find such a story. Like, how could a story be that powerful? All right, so part 2 is the adventure of Pi at sea. If you only read part 2, you could just basically take the entire thing out of context. It's just a great adventure tale. I don't know if you've ever read Kon-Tiki, which is like a classical tale of adventure at sea. It could work as a standalone work. There wouldn't be anything really deeper or anything of literary merit, but it's just interesting, right, to read about how someone survives. And that's the bulk of the work. So we do get this kind of long-winded introduction. We get introduced to Pi, and then we almost forget about part 1, basically. And then finally, part 3 is the very brief story of Pi's rescue. It includes a very brief and grim and violent alternate version to Pi's survival at sea, and then it also resolves kind of the fictional writer's relationship with So the second story, and you can reread it if you're not sure and aren't following the connections, but it starts on page 303. It's only a few pages long. So there was an explosion, and then there were four basic characters: the cook, Pi and his mother, and the sailor. So in this second story, the cook helps Pi to come aboard the life raft, where there's also his mother and the sailor. And the cook is just this really bad guy from the start, for the most part. He starts eating flies right away, even though they have like all this food. The cook is just like he's just desperate to eat. They just are disgusted by him. He makes them vomit several times. He eats a rat. Pi is very hungry, so he nibbles on the rat a little bit. This cook ate a lot of the only biscuits they had and offered some to Pi. He amputated the sailor's broken leg, not to, help him, but just to use the leg as bait, and then uses the rest of the sailor as bait. Vegetarian Pi and his mother in this second story, they do learn to eat the fish that the cook catches with the human bait. But then there's this fight. Pi is too weak to hold on to this turtle they were trying to catch. He drops it. The cook slaps him. Pi's mother fights back. The cook kills his mother. Pi then, a couple days later, kills the cook and survives in solitude for the remainder of the time. It's a very grim story. It would not fill a whole novel. It's not pleasant to read. The investigators who are trying to find out the truth, they respond with, "What a horrible story." But then they do notice similarities, like the sailor is basically the zebra. They both have broken legs. The hyena bit off the leg for the sailor and the zebra. The mother has qualities like the orangutan. And then the blind Frenchman, who we meet later, admitted to killing a man and a woman. In the second story, the cook kills a man and a woman. Pi, it appears, is the tiger. So in the second story, basic humans replace animal characters. And if you think about the implications of that, it's really kind of frightening, because it's much less frightening for animals to act as animals, and it's much more frightening when humans act as animals. When Pi finishes telling his two stories, he says, "Okay, I told you two stories that account for the 227 days in between, the sinking and the rescue. Neither explains the sinking, neither makes a factual difference. You can't prove which one is true. You got to take my word for it. In both stories, my family dies, I suffer. So tell me, since it makes no factual difference to you, which story do you prefer? Which is the better story, the story with animals or the story without the animals?" And the interrogator answers, "The story with the animals is the better story." And Pi says, "Thank you." And so it goes with God. So we need to figure out, what does he mean by this? And at that point, the interviewer say, "Oh my gosh, he's crying." He's so happy that they've chosen the animal story. So what does he mean? What is the connection he's making between any set of beliefs, religious or none, and the two stories that he told? Why do the interrogators in the report conclude that he survived, quote, "in the company of an adult Bengal tiger"? They chose the animal story, even though earlier in the interrogation they questioned it and they said no one's going to believe that, and they were supposed to be making this, report that would be believable. All right, so we also have to look at characterization. This whole story is told basically through Pi's perspective, and we get Pi's own words, and we also get the observations of this, supposedly neutral fictional author who's writing about Pi's story. So his background, obviously, he has a lot of religious diversity. Hinduism is his home religion, and he keeps talking about how he does understand the world through Hinduism, but then every time he encounters another viewpoint, he's accepting of that and he wants to understand it. He also, as we know, grew up in a zoo, and he got to experience animal behaviors that to him were ordinary, but to most are not ordinary. So we want to think about how that background kind of informs his journey. If he were a strict follower of just one religion, for example, would he have a different experience on this lifeboat? We also need to look at his mental state and his changing mental state. So he has an example of when he's younger and people make fun of his name Piscine by slightly mispronouncing a syllable. He has to take action. So he's pressed into a corner, he's being bullied, and then he has to train his classmates and teachers to call him Pi instead of making fun of his name. Are there other times when he's also pressed into a corner and he has to do something, take some kind of action in order to survive? We know literally in the first story, he trains Richard Parker so that he can survive. Is there anything figurative going on? And if that first story with the animals isn't meant to be read literally, Is there something else going on? When pushed into a corner, did Pi take kind of extreme action to make things work out? There's lots and lots of paradoxes surrounding Pi. He's a vegetarian, but he ends up eating meat. He hates but also and fears Richard Parker, but also saves him several times, and is actually sad when Richard Parker leaves unceremoniously. Pi obviously practices multiple religions at once, and these religions have just inherent contradictions, right? You can't believe both things because they're saying opposite things. He also embraces atheism as a faith, as well as all the sciences. And he both considers animals as real, but yes, they're real, they're dangerous, they're not humans, but he does admit that he may have anthropomorphized animals until they spoke fluent English and complained about things and whatnot. So he's a walking contradiction. But he's also very optimistic. And one of the reasons I like ending with Pi, the novel, it's just very optimistic after some sort of grim pieces that we've read over the course of the year. He's always optimistic. He takes conflict, and even if it's really bad at first, he tries to make the best of it. So, talking with Mr. Kumar in chapter 7, we analyze this passage. His belief in God is shaken, and he doesn't understand how this teacher he really respects could be an atheist, but he does end up reconciling that and studying zoology in college as a result. Pi also mentions several times that a good sign of an animal's health is that it reproduces. On page 40, he mentions this, and then again in the island chapter, he mentions that Richard Parker has had so many meerkats that he's fulfilled in terms of his basic survival, and he's like tearing apart trees and things in search of a mate. So the mention of that, along with the frame story, where we ultimately find out that Pi has grown up and has two kids of his own, help us understand his mental state. He is optimistic enough. He wasn't scarred enough by this journey across the sea, to not have kids of his own. So there's lots of paradoxes in Pi's life that he resolves. The kind of bigger idea, is there a paradox in the survival story that would require him to reconcile? So the fact that he might have had to kill, and he's a very nonviolent person, or the fact that he might have had to eat meat, and he doesn't like doing that. Could he have had to come up with an alternate story or an alternate explanation to help him make sense of things? All right, more about Pi's mental state. Pi does admit early on in the book on page 41, he says, all living things contain a measure of madness that moves them in strange, sometimes inexplicable ways. This madness can be saving. It is part and parcel of the ability to adapt. Without it, no species would survive. Well, so what? In the frame tale, Pi admits that madness is survival, right? He tells this to the fictional author. Before the island, there's some weird stuff going on, right? Pi is talking to Richard Parker, the blind Frenchman. He possibly commits murder, or was that Richard Parker? I don't know. Maybe he hallucinated the whole thing because he's got that whole dream rag that he uses to asphyxiate himself. So he does seem to be, in any of those cases, moving through a state of madness. Did the madness help him pass the time at sea? Was part of his time at sea helped by him kind of losing grasp on reality? Are there other examples in history where genius was misunderstood as madness? More on Pi's mental state, and this is what I was just referring to, this dream cloth that he has. He has a damp cloth and he asphyxiates himself with it so that he falls into a daze, and he says, I would be visited by the most extraordinary dreams, trances, visions, thoughts, sensations, remembrances. Time would be gobbled up. So he enters this altered state on purpose to pass the time. He wants to have visions and trances and things like that. So to me, and this is, we'll talk about this in a minute, the necessary mandatory reader interaction with this plot. But to me, it seems like the blind Frenchman and the island, it's possible, but it's not very likely that these things happen. It seems much more likely to me that maybe something random happened, but he was using this asphyxiation method of altering his state, and he hallucinated a lot of this. It seems weird that this island has basically unlimited food, the perfect food for Richard Parker and the perfect food for Pi. So the question is, how could an altered mental state help explain the scene with the blind Frenchman and the island? Is there a more rational explanation in terms of the blind Frenchman? Was it Richard Parker taking action? Was it Pi taking action? Is there something literally happening that the story is kind of covering up? More about paradox. So we have the sloth. In chapter 1, Pye describes his zoology thesis, it's a functional analysis of the thyroid gland of the three-toed sloth. And he chose the three-toed sloth because of its calm demeanor, quiet, introspective, and he says it did something to soothe his shattered self. He describes the sloth, its only real habit is indolence. It's just lazy, right? It sleeps or rests on average 20 hours a day. Eyesight, speed, sense, wit, everything is scored as poor. How does it survive, you might ask? Pye says. Precisely by being slow. Sleepiness and slothfulness keep it out of harm's way. A sloth's hair shelter an algae that is brown during the dry season and green during the wet season. So the animal blends in with the surrounding moss and foliage and looks like a nest of white ants or squirrels, or like nothing at all but parts of a tree. It lives a peaceful vegetarian life in perfect harmony with its environment. So in some ways, I see a lot of connections between Pye and the sloth. In other ways, he was not obviously able to be the sloth all the time on his raft at sea. He was not able to remain a vegetarian. He was not able to remain peaceful the entire time. But I think the sloth is kind of what Pye aspires to be. Not so much in the laziness, but just in the way that it kind of transcends everything else. It's not involved in the day-to-day struggles of predator-prey. It just kind of does its own thing and doesn't care what others think. So you could write about how the sloth is a symbol in the novel. If they ask something about symbols, you could look at the sloth as a symbol. If you're also looking for other symbols, how can Richard Parker be a symbol? Is Richard Parker literally there on the raft the whole time? Or is there something else going on? Allegory. So an allegory is when a set of actions in a story really represents a larger or deeper idea. And this goes back to the power of stories that we've talked about. Pye allows the reader to understand the allegory of the work, Life of Pye, the novel that we're talking about, as he's speaking with the investigators, right? So they're trying to get the facts. They have to write this report, and they just arrive, and it's like they're tired. They kind of take for granted the fact that, Pye has just survived this crazy journey. They're tired. They just want the straight facts. And so Pye tells them the whole long animal story. They don't like it. They said it's not believable. So he tells them the second story, which is very gruesome. The two tales that Pye tells, the animal tale and the human tale, where there's just a lot of murder and cannibalism and whatnot, neither one provides any useful facts to these investigators, right? In both cases, Pye survives a shipwreck. We don't know why the ship sank. We just hear an explosion. Neither one changes the facts of life for the investigators. They're still there trying to find out answers. The animal story is pretty amazing. It's miraculous, right? The human story is grim. It basically highlights the worst of humanity. Which one is more pleasant to believe? What's the connection to religions? Think about the island chapter itself as an allegory. If Pye had stayed on the island, he would have continued to enjoy himself. He could have survived possibly through old age, and Richard Parker too. But Richard Parker, he was starting to get agitated because now that his physical being was filled, he needed something more. So he was looking for a mate. Pye was looking for some kind of spiritual fulfillment. And he realizes if he had just stayed on that island, it would have been a spiritual death. Nothing would challenge him or change him. He would have just stagnated, right? He explains early on that he was comfortable with Hinduism. It's his home religion. He loves it. He says, with its notions in my mind, I see my place in the universe. But we should not cling. And he uses an exclamation point there. Don't cling, don't cling. So what message is he saying to the reader? Like, should we not get comfortable if we find an island that has exactly what we want? Should we not get comfortable on that island? Should we go seek out further things? And think about how this connects to Pye's willingness to accept things that I think most believers of anything, science or faith, wouldn't accept, right? Pye encounters another religion, and he just tries to reconcile and understand how they kind of go together. He finds an atheist, and he tries to reconcile how that itself is a type of faith. So this novel is all about the power of stories. When we read this work, how can this work, the novel Life of Pye, be read as an allegory? Some other examples before we answer that question of the power of stories. Pye's father knew that telling him about the danger of a tiger was not enough, so he had to show him in a very gruesome way. Pye's father, he aspires to be very modern. He doesn't seem particularly enamored by any religions or anything like that. the way that he shows Pi how tigers are dangerous reminds me of Pi's second story. It's just very straightforward and gruesome. Obviously, if you put a goat next to a tiger's cage and you make the tiger very hungry, the tiger is going to kill the goat in a very gruesome way. And Pi's father didn't like to romanticize things. He worried that Pi would anthropomorphize animals, which Pi kind of did, right? The animal as seen through human eyes is the most dangerous animal in the world, he thought. He doesn't like how people impose stories or personalities on animals. But even Pi's father, who doesn't seem to like many of the stories that are available, he was captivated by a story. He really dismissed religion for the most part, but he was captivated by his business partner's story about this most perfect swimming pool in the universe. Pi's father didn't even know how to swim or enjoy swimming, but he loved the story of the swimming pool so much that he actually named his son after a swimming pool. I cannot imagine naming my kids after a swimming pool. Like, that's got to be a really awesome swimming pool. So even the power of stories, it just had to be the right story that captivated Pi's father. Think about if there are other stories in the novel that have had power over characters, major characters or minor characters. What other stories captivated Pi? What other stories captivate some of the religious leaders or Pi's mother or others? On the life raft, Pi said, "My greatest wish, other than salvation, was to have a book, a long book with a never-ending story, one I could read again and again, with new eyes and a fresh understanding each time." Pi has always embraced religions because of the stories that compose them, right? With endless time at sea, how many of the things he experienced could have been a story he created to help him explain away the unthinkable accident and this unfathomable time adrift? I mean, can you imagine spending just 24 hours stuck on a very small life raft with just yourself, no technology, no entertainment? I think it would get old very fast, and he's on there for 220 some days. So think about all the stories that were presented within the novel. What about religions? Do they provide endless stories that we can read with fresh eyes each time? Do people turn to religious texts over and over, and each time they read it, at each stage in their life, does it give them new insight? Or do you have a favorite book that you read, and each time you read it, you get new insight? I'm thinking of, for example, The Great Gatsby. When I first read it, I was much younger, obviously. I was in school. And so I had different perceptions of the characters. And then as I got older, I could relate to different characters in different ways. And so I brought to it, fresh eyes each time. How about science? Is science a never-ending story? Is science constantly changing? Are we constantly updating that story with fresh insight? And there's another thing, it's kind of one of those paradoxes and ironies of the book. So this is a book about stories and the power of stories, but there's so much in the book about the failure of words. Pi describes his home religion and some of the elements that make up Hinduism. And he says, the universe makes sense to me through Hindu eyes. And he describes a concept from Hinduism that exists without qualities. It doesn't have any physical things that we can imagine. He says it lies beyond our understanding, beyond description, beyond approach. With our poor words, we sew a suit for it. We try to make it fit. But this concept he's talking about, it always bursts the seams. We're left speechless. So words fail. When you're looking at a true thought, something that's not tangible, words cannot help us to imagine that. But he said there is another concept that does have qualities, this truth of the world, where the suit fits something physical that we try to put on. It does fit. We can approach it with some understanding. It's made manifest to our limited senses. It's expressed not only in gods, but in humans, animals, trees, earth. Everything has a trace of the divine in it. And so he thinks of that which sustains the universe beyond thought and language, and that which is at the core of us and struggles for expression as being part of the same thing. So he's basically saying there's truth in the world, kind of this capital T truth, something that we can't fully understand. And it's really hard with our limited senses to put those ideas into words that are tangible and shareable. When describing the zoo, he even admits, and he used beautiful description, but he says language founders in such seas. Better to picture it in your head if you want to feel it. So something to think about, and possibly a larger idea coming from this book. Do pure thoughts use language? When you're just thinking of a thought, do you use language to think of that thought, or does it transcend language? Once you put a thought into language, does it limit human ability to communicate? Does putting an idea into language change its meaning? I'm thinking about Janie from Their Eyes Are Watching God. She had this experience under the pear tree, and she really was not able to articulate it to her grandmother. To her grandmother, when Janie tried to explain in a very clumsy way, it just sounded like Janie was being whimsical and didn't really have any strong vision for her future. But it was the opposite. She was not able to articulate this vision that seemed to transcend the senses. And in that vision that Janie had, the author even described she heard a noise, but it didn't have to do with her ears. So there's this idea of ideas that transcend the senses. So words do fail, even though ironically the book is about stories. When we tell a story and put it into words, do we change the meaning of it a little bit? This brings us to the end of the novel. On page 302, this is really toward the end, Pai and the Japanese investigators are discussing the definition of a story. Like, what is a story? And they tell Pai, well, in Japanese, a story has to have an element of invention. So they're kind of implying, like, are you fictionalizing this story? But Pai says telling something using words, no matter the language, right, is already something of an invention. So he's saying there's ideas. Once we put them into words, we're automatically in some ways kind of inventing them or fictionalizing them, right? He said, isn't just looking upon this world already something of an invention? He says the world isn't just the way it is, it's how we understand it, no? And in understanding something, we bring something to it, no? Doesn't that make life a story? And so what he's implying here kind of hints at another larger meaning of this work. We impose meaning on things, right? By living, by experiencing, we each bring our own meaning to things. And so there's not just one truth to understand, there is a truth, and then there's the way that we interpret the truth. So that's a larger question to understand. For Hamlet, think about how he was away at college. Did his studies of literature and philosophy, do you think, taint his understanding of his uncle? His mother, who doesn't seem as educated as Hamlet, was kind of able to take things more in stride. Like, I'm sure she wasn't happy marrying, her husband's brother, but she didn't think of things as deeply as Hamlet, and it didn't disturb her as much. She took the more practical approach. So Hamlet's background and what he's bringing to the table changed the meaning of that. And then we talked about Janie already. Did her experience under the pear tree change her understanding of the world? Why did everyone else really dislike Tea Cake, but Janie, saw him in a different way? Was it her experience with the pear tree that made that? What about Meursault? He's obviously condemned. Yes, he was a murderer, but he's condemned because basically society doesn't like him. He doesn't have emotions. If he lived in a society that was very logical, do you think they'd understand his reactions to his mother's death a little bit more than Algeria in 1940? So think about, do we change the meaning by bringing our own understanding to something? And the last point, and this is what makes this book really unique, there is mandatory reader involvement, and the author has admitted this in interviews. So mostly The Blind Frenchman and The Island, this is the bizarre part. What's going on? So the author admitted, Martel, he wanted to take the reader so far, but then make them take a leap of logic. So Pai admits, he says, atheists are my brothers and sisters of a different faith. Every word they speak speaks of faith. Like me, they go as far as the legs of reason will carry them, and then they leap. So Pai is implying that in any religion, science, or any belief set, there's only so much that logic will prove, right? There's always going to be something missing that requires a leap of faith. So even if you think about the Big Bang, well, that's scientific. The Big Bang created the universe, right? Well, where did the material come from in the first place? Can that be proven? Or is that kind of a leap of faith that people are taking? If they believe in that theory, are they sort of taking a leap of faith? What are some possible explanations of these two scenes, the Blind Frenchman and the island? What evidence does the reader have to support each interpretation? So is one literal? Could it have literally happened? I mean, it's possible, right? It's not plausible or likely, but it is possible. Everything that happened could have happened. We do have evidence about that dream rag that he has, right? He asphyxiates himself and tries to hallucinate. At this point in the novel, he's near death. He's starving. If you've ever been very, very sick and delirious, he's not thinking straight. So there's lots of evidence that maybe it's not literally the Blind Frenchman and the island, but at the same time, there's a lot of amazing things in the world and coincidences. It could be true, right? Same thing with the alternate story at the end. So Pai has spent all of part 2 talking about the animal story, and then at the end we have this very grim human story with cannibalism and murder. Does Martel answer for sure which of the two stories really happened and why? So Martel, the author, he wanted the reader to 100% have to commit. So he took us so far. Okay, look, this is, I've plausibly explained Pi grew up among animals. He was able to train Richard Parker, same way he trained all his students and teachers to, learn his name again. So look, he's good at training and things like that. So he took us so far, and then he's like, okay, here's something really weird. Do you still believe me now? He's forcing you to be pulled out of the story. He jars you out of the narrative and forces you to actively, choose something. You can't just go along with it. And Pi says he doesn't like agnostics because they're just so indecisive. Pick a side. Are you an atheist? Are you religious? Are you a scientist? Just pick something. And the author is forcing us to do that. You can't just be neutral. Otherwise, you're not going to understand the Blind Frenchman scene or the island. You have to choose a side. So he's using the form of his work, the structure, to kind of mimic the idea. So here's some extended connections. What you want to do is go back through these slides and choose what are some meanings, some larger meanings of the work. It could be the power of stories, the way we bring changes to an idea when we try to articulate it. There's lots of possibilities in this book. Think about how to extend connections. So to get that sophistication point, one of the things you could do is extend connections. So we talked about in this unit, the whole search for meaning, different ways that characters find meaning. So Janie, this was a more typical journey. This was an imposed meaning. The pear tree vision, it's like a divine message, right? She has this divine calling, and then she schedules her whole life around that divine calling. She makes some mistakes, but she basically follows the archetypal journey, going through trials and things like that, and then ultimately she is a master of two worlds, right? So that was more typical. Then we have the existentialist and the absurdist. So remember, the existentialists believe that meaning can only be answered individually. There's no universal meaning, and there's no authority that can tell you what the meaning is. You have to find that yourself. Hamlet, I think, fell kind of into this camp. He tormented himself trying to figure out what authority would give his life meaning. While he did strongly believe in his religion, there was no unquestioning voice of authority to tell him, like, yes, this is definitely your father's ghost. You definitely are justified killing your uncle. He was trying to figure out what that authority would be. And so he was tormenting himself the way I think many existentialists would. Like, it's a very difficult responsibility to have to constantly define your life. Absurdists, on the other hand, they believe the search for meaning will lead you nowhere because there's no meaning to be found. So Meursault, very pessimistic, he took the easy route of accepting there's no meaning to be found, so just don't bother, right? It didn't work out too well for him. Pi seems to be the opposite of that. He'll find meaning in everything, right? But he does share some qualities with the existentialists. He does believe there's a meaning to be found, but he seems to believe that there's multiple, I think possibly infinite ways to find that meaning. Instead of taking this to be a burden, which like Hamlet obviously saw this as a major burden, Pi sees this as an opportunity. Each set of beliefs he sees as a story. Each religion is one story or several. Each division of science is a story. Even every animal is a story, right? Atheism has its own story. He was fascinated by the fact that having polio would make Mr. Kumar an atheist and a scientist rather than a follower of religion. But Pi would argue that each of these stories is just an imperfect way of explaining the same truth, right? So where Mr. Kumar said that science cured him from polio, Pi might say, well, maybe some divine intervention caused the cure to be found, right? So Pi would say they're just different ways of explaining the same truth, and that truth is really, we can't put it into words. We're imperfect, right? Language founders. So every story has facts and logic, but each one also has holes that require a leap of faith. So for Pi, there is a universal truth, but in trying to understand and articulate that truth, so in imposing words in it, we're changing it.